If the cold, the snow, and the hunger didn't finish you, sickness very well might. For colonists in the 1600s, winter was not only a season of hardship, it was also a season of disease. Packed tightly into small, drafty cabins, breathing the same stale air, eating the same meager food, settlers were vulnerable to every cough and fever that spread through the community. 1. Common winter sicknesses. The most frequent illnesses colonists faced were fevers, respiratory problems, and digestive diseases. Pneumonia, influenza, tuberculosis, and smallpox claimed countless lives. Even a simple cold could turn deadly when combined with malnutrition and freezing nights. Children often suffered the worst. Weakened by hunger, they were the first to catch winter sickness and the least likely to recover. Colonists described long nights where the sound of coughing echoed through their cabins like drums of despair. Dysentery caused by contaminated water and poor sanitation also struck during winter months. With little fresh produce and a diet heavy in salted or dried meat, digestive troubles became common and dangerous. 2. Poor sanitation and crowded living. Colonial cabins were small, often one-room structures where entire families lived, ate, and slept. With fires burning constantly, the air was smoky and damp. Bedding was rarely washed in winter, and clean water was hard to come by. In these conditions, illness spread like wildfire. If one member of the household caught a fever, chances were high that everyone else would fall sick. Colonists didn't understand germs, but they knew that crowded conditions made sickness worse. Still, with few choices, they huddled together for warmth, trading safety from the cold for exposure to disease. 3. Limited medical knowledge. Doctors were rare in the colonies, especially in rural areas. Most families relied on home remedies or community healers. Settlers carried over European medical traditions, bleeding, purging, or using leeches, though these often did more harm than good. Herbs like sage, thyme, and willow bark were used to treat fevers and pain. Garlic was believed to strengthen the body, and honey was used as a healing salve. Still, many treatments were based on superstition rather than science. A poultice might relieve symptoms, but it rarely cured the underlying illness. 4. Native American healing knowledge. One of the colonists' greatest lifelines came from the people who had survived these winters for centuries, the Native Americans. Indigenous healers introduced colonists to plants like sassafras for colds, willow bark for fever, and yarrow for wounds. They also taught practices like sweat lodges and herbal teas, which sometimes proved more effective than European methods. Colonists often wrote in journals that native remedies did much to preserve our lives. These exchanges of knowledge were not just cultural, but matters of life and death. 5. Faith, prayer, and belief. When medicine failed, colonists turned to their faith. Illness was often seen as a test from God, or even as punishment for sin. Families gathered to pray over the sick, hoping for divine healing. Ministers visited cabins, offering words of comfort and leading community fasts in hopes of ending outbreaks. Though prayer could not stop disease, it gave settlers hope, and in the darkness of a winter night, hope was as vital as food or fire. 6. Community and care. Despite the risk, colonists often cared for one another during outbreaks. Neighbors might bring firewood or food to sick families. Women acted as nurses, tending to both their own households and others in the settlement. But this kindness carried danger. Helping the sick often meant falling ill yourself. Still, survival was not a solitary effort. Colonists learned that without community care, no settlement could endure. 7. The toll of disease. Winter sickness left deep scars. Entire families were sometimes lost. In small villages, epidemics could wipe out half the population. Colonists recorded these tragedies in grim detail. Rows of graves dug into frozen ground, mothers burying children, communities praying for spring to bring relief. Yet even in the face of such devastation, settlers endured. Each winter taught them hard lessons: how to prepare better, how to share knowledge, and how to cling to both medicine and faith. For colonists, survival wasn't just about building shelters or storing food. It was about outlasting the sickness that winter carried into their homes. Every cough was a warning, every fever a threat. And yet, through faith, community, and the exchange of knowledge, they fought to endure. But sickness was not the only battle. In the next section, we'll see how faith itself became both a weapon and a shield, guiding colonists through the darkest nights of winter. When food ran low, when sickness spread, and when the icy winds howled through every crack of the cabin, there was one resource colonists never allowed themselves to lose: faith. In the frozen silence of winter, prayer and belief became as important as fire and food. For many settlers, spiritual strength was the thread that held their fragile lives together. 1. Faith as strength in desperation. In times of starvation or sickness, colonists often turned to prayer before they turned to action. Families gathered by firelight, whispering psalms from the Bible. Some settlers believed that God had sent winter as a test of their devotion. Others saw every successful hunt or recovered illness as divine mercy. Faith didn't warm the body, but it gave settlers the will to endure when their bodies were at their weakest. Many journals from the 1600s mention long nights of fasting and prayer where colonists pleaded for deliverance from the cold. 2. Ministers as leaders of survival. Ministers were not just spiritual guides. They were often the moral anchors of a settlement. In villages, ministers called for days of fasting and community prayer whenever an outbreak or famine struck. They preached resilience from the pulpit, reminding colonists that their suffering had meaning. Some sermons blamed hardship on sin, urging people to repent. Others encouraged unity, teaching that God's people would only survive if they cared for one another. Whether through fear or hope, ministers gave meaning to suffering, and meaning often translated into strength. 3. Rituals and daily prayer. Faith was woven into the daily rhythm of survival. Morning prayers before venturing into the snow, blessings over the smallest meal, and nightly psalms before bed reminded settlers that God's hand was always present. During blizzards, entire families might kneel together for hours, praying that their cabin roof would hold. In the silence of the frozen forest, prayer was often the only sound settlers could offer against the endless winter. 4th, witchcraft, fear, and the unknown. But faith also carried fear. When sickness struck without explanation, whispers of witchcraft sometimes followed. Colonists feared that unseen spiritual forces might be working against them. While the Salem witch trials would not erupt until decades later, the seeds of that fear were already present in the 1600s. In desperate winters, faith could divide as much as it united, casting suspicion on neighbors when tragedy struck. 5. Native beliefs and spiritual exchange. Colonists also witnessed the faith practices of Native Americans, who offered prayers to spirits of nature and performed rituals for hunting, health, and protection. Some colonists dismissed these practices as pagan, but others quietly respected them, even learning herbal prayers and seasonal ceremonies. Though the two faith systems often clashed, both groups shared one truth: survival was not only physical, but deeply spiritual. 6. Faith as community glue. Perhaps most importantly, shared belief brought people together. In the dead of winter, communities gathered in small wooden churches lit by candles. Singing hymns in freezing air, the settlers felt united. Faith gave them a reason to endure, to believe spring would return, and that their struggles were not meaningless. Even funerals became moments of strength. As colonists buried loved ones in frozen ground, prayers reminded the living that their suffering was temporary and their souls had eternal purpose. 7. Faith as hope for the future. Faith gave settlers a future beyond the winter. Every child born, every harvest that returned in spring was seen as evidence of God's favor. Prayer reminded colonists that their sacrifices and losses were not wasted, but part of a divine story greater than themselves. In the end, faith was survival, not the kind that filled the belly or warmed the body, but the kind that gave settlers the will to keep walking, keep fighting, and keep believing when the world around them froze. Through faith, colonists found meaning in misery and strength in weakness. It was belief that turned tragedy into purpose and gave them the courage to face another day. But as powerful as faith was, it could not stop every storm. In the next section, we'll uncover the tragedies of winter, the moments when survival failed and winter claimed its price. Section 9, the toll of winter, tragedy and loss. For every story of survival, there was another of tragedy. Harsh winters in the 1600s were not just battles against cold, they were seasons of grief. Families that worked, prayed, and struggled still found themselves burying loved ones in frozen soil. Winter was an unforgiving judge, and not every settler made it to spring. 1. Starvation and hunger's edge. When food stores ran out, desperation set in. Colonists boiled leather for broth, chewed on bark, and rationed every crumb of bread. Diaries from Jamestown speak of settlers digging up roots in frozen ground and even boiling shoe leather to keep hunger at bay. Some families survived on little more than cornmeal and melted snow. Others wasted away slowly, their bodies too weak to fight the cold. Hunger hollowed faces, thinned bodies, and broke the spirit of many. 2. Disease and weakness. Winter and sickness worked hand in hand. Malnutrition left colonists too weak to resist disease. Fevers spread rapidly in cramped, smoky cabins. Children were especially vulnerable, and families often lost their youngest first. Without medicine, even small illnesses became death sentences. What began as a cough or fever could quickly end in tragedy. The sound of hacking coughs and cries of grief became part of winter's soundtrack. 3. Death in isolation. For settlers living in scattered homesteads or on the frontier, isolation turned tragedy into loneliness. A family might lose members with no neighbors nearby to help dig graves in the frozen earth. Those who survived often endured grief in silence, staring across a snow-covered landscape with no one to comfort them. Isolation made every loss feel deeper, every silence heavier. Winter didn't just kill bodies, it starved the soul. 4. Burial in frozen ground. When death came, it left settlers with a cruel challenge. The earth itself was frozen solid. Graves had to be hacked out of icy ground with axes and shovels. In some cases, families kept the bodies of loved ones inside until the ground softened. Simple wooden crosses marked many graves, while others went unmarked in the snow. Entire families sometimes vanished into the earth, remembered only in village records and church prayers. 5. Psychological toll, fear, and despair. Even for those who lived, the weight of tragedy lingered. Colonists lived in constant fear that the next blizzard, the next illness, the next empty storehouse might claim them. Anxiety haunted long nights when the wind howled through cracks in the walls. Some settlers spoke of hearing the voices of winter in the storms, as though nature itself mocked their suffering. Depression and hopelessness were as deadly as hunger. The cold killed, but so did despair. 6. The stories passed down. Every community had tales of winters so deadly they became legend. Jamestown's starving time of 1609 to 1610, when over half the colony perished, was whispered about for decades. Other villages had their own stories, of entire families gone, of churches half empty by spring. These stories weren't just records of loss, they were warnings. They taught later generations to fear winter and prepare with all their strength. 7. Strength born from tragedy. Yet even tragedy had meaning. Survivors often spoke of loss as proof of resilience. Every funeral was followed by renewed determination to endure. Every child who lived became a symbol of hope. Colonists believed that God tested them through winter, and those who survived were stronger for it. The toll was great, but so was the strength born from grief. Winter claimed lives, and tragedy was written into the snow of every settlement. Hunger, sickness, and grief were the heavy prices of survival. Yet in every loss, settlers found lessons and reasons to endure. In the next section, we will see how communities learned to prepare, how past tragedies forged new strategies for survival against the endless cold. Section 10. Winter Celebrations and Traditions. Even in the darkest winters, settlers knew that survival was not only about food and fire, it was about spirit. When nights were long and the cold pressed in, they looked for joy, ritual, and celebration to remind themselves that life still had meaning. For colonists, winter was not only a season of struggle, but also a season of tradition. 1. Early colonial Christmas. For most settlers, Christmas was not the grand festival we imagine today. Puritan colonists in New England often frowned upon loud celebrations, considering them too close to pagan customs. Yet despite restrictions, many families still marked the season quietly, gathering for prayer, sharing small meals, or exchanging simple gifts like handmade tools, knitted mittens, or baked bread. In Virginia and the southern colonies, where traditions were more relaxed, Christmas sometimes brought feasts, music, and even games. Colonists decorated with greenery like holly and ivy, reminders of life in the heart of winter. 2. Midwinter feasts and shared meals. Food was scarce, but communities often set aside part of their harvest for a winter feast. Neighbors gathered to share roasted venison, wild turkey, corn pudding, and spiced cider. These meals were not only about eating, but about building unity. In such feasts, laughter, stories, and music filled the air, pushing back against the cold silence outside. Even a small shared meal gave settlers the sense that they were not alone in their struggle. 3. Music, dance, and storytelling. When work ended and darkness fell early, families turned to music and storytelling for warmth of the soul. Fiddles, flutes, and drums carried tunes that lifted spirits. Songs passed down from England, Scotland, or Ireland filled cabins with familiar melodies, while new colonial songs were born out of hardship. Storytelling was equally powerful. Around the fire, elders told tales of old homelands, of survival in past winters, and of legends both sacred and mysterious. These moments gave settlers a sense of continuity, binding generations together. 4. Candlelight and symbolism of light. Light carried deep meaning in winter. Colonists often lit extra candles in December, symbolizing hope and faith. In some communities, candles were placed in windows to welcome travelers or neighbors, shining like beacons in the snow. The glow of firelight became a ritual itself, a reminder that even in darkness, warmth and life still remained. These simple traditions helped colonists see beyond hardship to believe spring would return. 5. Blending traditions with native customs. In certain regions, colonists observed native celebrations of the winter season. Some tribes held midwinter ceremonies with feasts, dances, and storytelling that honored the turning of the year. Colonists who witnessed or shared in these practices were reminded that winter could be a time of renewal as well as survival. Though cultural barriers remained, small exchanges of ritual, songs, foods, or seasonal observances added richness to colonial winter life. 6. Weddings and community gatherings. No. Winter was also a season for weddings. With the harvest done and time available, many settlers chose the colder months for marriage. These ceremonies brought joy to entire villages, often followed by feasts and music that lifted spirits for weeks. Community gatherings, whether weddings, church meetings, or barn dances, were vital in keeping hope alive during long winters. 7. Hope for the coming spring. Above all, winter celebrations were about hope. Every candle, every hymn, every feast reminded settlers that winter was not eternal. By coming together, they made the cold bearable and the darkness less frightening. Celebrations gave colonists something more powerful than food or fire, the belief that joy could survive even the harshest storm. Section 11. Legacy of Survival. Lessons for Generations. Winter in colonial America was more than a season. It was a test. Every storm, every empty field, every cold night shaped the settlers who faced it. And though many paid with hardship, hunger, or even their lives, what endured was a legacy of survival. 1. Adapting to the new world over time, settlers learned how to better prepare for winters. Early mistakes, arriving too late in the season, building poor shelters, mismanaging food, gave way to careful planning. Colonists stored larger reserves of corn, salted meat, dried fish, and preserved fruits. Cabins became sturdier, with thicker walls and stone chimneys. Communities built stronger ties, ensuring no family faced winter entirely alone. These adaptations were not just responses to cold. They were strategies that transformed fragile colonies into thriving settlements. 2. Blending cultures, blending strengths. The survival of colonists was not accomplished alone. Native Americans introduced crops like corn and squash, showed how to track game, and taught techniques for winter travel and storage. At the same time, European traditions of candlelight, song, and midwinter feasts gave meaning and rhythm to the season. Together, these cultural exchanges built a foundation for what we now recognize as early American traditions, rooted in hardship but blossoming into resilience. 3. The birth of American traditions. Many of today's customs trace their origins back to those winters. Simple Christmas gatherings, barn dances, storytelling by firelight, and communal meals all grew out of the settlers' need for warmth and hope. The idea of coming together during the darkest season, of finding light in the coldest nights, became woven into the American spirit. What began as survival turned into heritage. 4. Lessons passed through generations. By the late 1600s and into the 1700s, winter survival was no longer only about making it through. It was about teaching children the skills, stories, and values that would carry on. Elders told how their families braved the starving time, how neighbors saved one another, and how faith kept spirits alive. These stories were not only about history, they were warnings, guides, and sources of pride. They reminded each generation that survival was possible, but never guaranteed. 5. The enduring legacy. Looking back now, it is clear. The colonists' struggle with winter forged a culture of endurance. Their trials shaped not only how they lived, but how they remembered, celebrated, and believed. Each frostbitten night and each candlelit gathering added a thread to the fabric of America. Their greatest victory was not simply living through the cold, it was transforming survival into tradition, hardship into community, and despair into hope. Final closing script. From makeshift shelters to roaring fires, from hunger to feasts, from fear to faith, the winters of the 1600s shaped the very heart of early America. These were more than stories of cold. They were stories of courage. And as we close this chapter, remember, the spirit that carried them through still echoes in our lives today. Thank you for watching. If you found this journey into colonial winters fascinating, make sure to like, subscribe, and share. And stay tuned, because in part 2, we'll dive deeper into how settlers built farms, towns, and traditions that still shape the world we know today.